All right, so generally, when it's early in the morning and I'm in front of a bunch of strangers, I like to tell stories about sex. I hope you don't mind. So Daphnia is not a girl's name. It's actually the name of a water fly, a river fly, that has a particularly interesting sex life. When the environment is stable and they have good food supply and there's, the predators are not killing them or eating them, they don't have sex to reproduce. They just clone themselves. I'm not a biologist, I don't know how it works. They just make exact copies of themselves as their offspring. Now the interesting thing is, when the environment is disrupted, a new predator or a drought or just sort of something changes, they start having a lot of sex, like actual sex. Not because they want to have fun before the end of the world, but because they want to introduce error into the reproductive process. They want to introduce mutations, adaptions, create something that might have a better chance to survive in this new disrupted environment. And I think it's an interesting sort of analogy to kind of the business world, the technology world, the creative world, in terms of, we're constantly in a state of disruption. And so cloning yourself, doing the same thing over and over again, is not likely to survive. And so we need to, not have sex, but adapt, mutate, introduce error and failure into the process, which is a much different way of thinking about success and failure. All of us tend to, plan to succeed, like we all want to do well, and then a bit like what Francis was saying, when something goes wrong, when there's failure, it's like, at least I've learned something, and I'm going to pick myself back up and, try my best next time. And certainly the good ones in the room who think that way, have a certain, advantage in life that they're able to kind of withstand that type of failures. Whereas what I'm suggesting is you actually want to induce failure as a means to discover success. You want to have a systemic way of thinking about failure and how to take advantage of failure. This kind of thinking came to me at a conference. This is Professor Tracy Fullerton from the University of Southern California, in the game industry, one of the best-known academics. And about 10 years ago, I went to a conference, the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, and I walked in on her keynote, and she was up there giving a very impassioned speech about how she wanted all her students to fail. And I thought, that's a very mean professor. And of course, she elaborated that by failure, she meant she wanted them to explore, to experiment, to push the envelope, to test the boundaries. And inherently in doing that, not all of them would succeed. Now that didn't mean she gives them an F, it just means that it's part of the process where they try something grand and they fail along the way. And that's what she meant by failure. And that kind of stuck in my head. Soon after that, I went to Ireland. This is a Google image grab of, for maybe some of the folks that are a bit older in the room, clones of a game called Breakout. Breakout was the game that had the blocks on the top and the little ball at the bottom, and you sort of bumped the paddle and it sort of bounced and broke the blocks and so on. And early programmers or rookie programmers, when they're trying to learn how to make games, oftentimes they'll make clones of other games like Pac-Man or Space Invaders or Breakout. But I was at this conference in Ireland, and the teacher, there was a new university that was just starting a game program, and the professor was so excited and wanted to tell me all about the curriculum. And then I asked, what kind of projects do they do and so on. And they said, the whole education culminates in the creation of a Breakout clone. And I said, I didn't want to be too sort of negative, but I said, as students, they have the freedom. They don't have the marketing pressure and the budgets and all that kind of stuff. They should innovate. They should sort of have freedom to fail and try something new. And the professor said, I don't know how to grade innovation. And I thought, that was a bit sort of mind-boggling. And so this idea of innovation, obviously all of us in the creative industries think of it, constantly. There's this great book from many years ago, The Innovator's Dilemma. How many have read The Innovators? Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah, so this is one you want to read. It's more about technology than creativity per se, or technical innovation, but the lessons are broadly applied. It has nothing to do with the game industry, but in short, the innovator's dilemma is that the very things you do to succeed today will fail for you tomorrow. Meaning, kind of going back to the Daphnia, the environment shifts. So all the things that you optimize for, all the things that you train for and specialize in based on the rules of the game today, as the rules change, those very things that you were good at sort of cause you to fail. And so, again, this idea of how to avoid the failure and or adopt the failure in order to create innovation is an important process. And this sort of systematic way of thinking then brings me to Darwin, kind of connecting again the dots with the Daphnia, this kind of evolutionary process or evolutionary system. There are three elements to a Darwinistic system of evolution. The first one is a high degree of variation, meaning there's a lot of experiments or a lot of offspring or a lot of attempts or shots on goal, etc. That there's some way to determine a fitness, or what gets to survive versus what doesn't. And the third one being a high degree of survivability, meaning you can fail a bunch, but as long as you don't take down the whole species as you experiment, or you don't bankrupt your company as you sort of try new products or ideas, then you can continue to exist as a species or company as you try these new experiments. In terms of variation, I think we're doing pretty good. You can look across, whether it's the game industry or the movie industry, music, literature, all these other technical and creative industries, there's an explosion of output. In part just because we're all creative people, in part because the tools of creation have been democratized to a certain extent. Certainly in the game industry, the barriers to entry have dropped. And so there is this sort of velocity. There is a high degree of creation, regardless of what industry you're in. And then this notion of quantity related to quality is an interesting one. There's another great book called The Medici Effect that sort of first clued me into this issue of quantity. So the main premise of the book is that breakthrough ideas or innovation happen at the intersection of two different things. That could be two different cuisines, two different cultures, two different academic disciplines or businesses. That's where the interesting stuff happens. That's the main point of the book. But within the book, there was a whole section about failure, about sort of getting past failure, about sort of an explosion of ideas. And it was the first time I saw that quality was most highly correlated with quantity. So the author was looking at musicians, painters, academics, and trying to understand, where did the good stuff come from? And the research showed that those creators who did the most work did the best work. Meaning, and I forget now some of the examples, but the Beatles, they did a whole bunch of songs and sort of stuff way in the beginning that enabled them to create the good stuff. Or he cited painters, that the painters who painted the most paintings also had the paintings that were worth the most. And he kind of went through a whole bunch of different sectors and industries looking at that kind of effect. And for me, the sort of the greatest kind of synthesis of that idea is Babe Ruth, who for many, many, many years held the record for the most home runs. So the most home runs or hits or both or whatever. What a lot of people didn't realize is he also had the record for the most misses. So that guy just swung at everything. He ended up hitting a bunch, but he also missed a hell of a lot. And so that kind of is a nice, summation of that concept of the link between quantity and quality. We see this a lot in the game industry in particular. These are two independent designers, Ron Carmel and Kyle Gabler. The studio is 2D Boy, and famously they made a game called World of Goo, which is a few years old now. I think it was released in 2006 or 2007 on the iPad, and remains to this day one of the best-selling iPad games of all time. They had earlier versions that were released on a Nintendo DS and PC, I believe. But it started as an experiment. They were students, master's degree students at Carnegie Mellon, and they challenged themselves to make a new game every week. Now, I mean, they weren't making a full-fledged game every week. It was more of an experiment, a prototype, and so on. But in addition to their coursework, every week they built a new game. Over the course of a semester, they made 50 new games. One of those games was called Tower of Goo, which then became World of Goo. The other 49 games, like nobody knows. Who cares? They were junk. They were garbage. But it was the process of creating 50 of them and throwing away 49 that enabled them to discover the one that then became this sort of mega seller. And so this sort of brings me to the Black Swan. I'm guessing this one's maybe a little bit more popular in the crowd here. This notion of sort of the highly improbable. And in many ways in the game industry and certainly in other creative industries or entertainment industries, the successes tend to be the Black Swans, meaning most of the stuff we produce is actually crap. And or it's kind of good, but just doesn't survive in the marketplace. And so then it's quite rare the stuff that's actually good and does well commercially. And so, the Black Swan really speaks to this sort of notion of the improbable and how we can, not really predict what's unpredictable, but sort of set ourselves up to explore those spaces. One of the really interesting concepts from the Black Swan is what I thought was fun was the turkey problem, or what's more or better known scientifically as the induction problem, where and he calls it the turkey problem because as humans we have a very hard time sort of anticipating the future. We tend to base our future thinking off of past events. And so he summarized this as the turkey problem because imagine a turkey who, every day wakes up, the farmer comes to feed it, takes a dump, goes back to sleep, wakes up the next morning, the farmer comes, feeds it, the same cycle over again. And so if you ask the turkey what's going to happen tomorrow, the turkey will say, well, I'll wake up, the farmer will feed me, I'll take a dump, I'll go back to sleep until Thanksgiving. Right? The turkey has no ability, there's no data in its environment or world for it to anticipate the arrival of Thanksgiving, because every other day has been the same day, and then boom, it's Thanksgiving. So as humans, this tends to be sort of a similar trap that we have. Like Franz says, we don't anticipate or predict that we're going to smash our car in the garage, because every other day we've backed out of the garage, we've made it out safely. Well, I assume you haven't smashed other parts of your car, but anyway, so that's kind of an interesting sort of gap or trap in our thinking. In many ways, a lot of the biggest successes in the game industry are kind of turkey problems, and it's totally coincidental that I'm using Angry Birds as an example of the turkey problem. But I'm guessing most of the people in the room have played Angry Birds, even though maybe some of you won't admit to it. But so Angry Birds is an interesting story. Where it was created by a studio in Helsinki called Rovio that was founded in 2003. So this is like the game industry's best overnight success. But most people don't realize they existed since over 10 years ago. They had made 51 games prior to making Angry Birds. Do any of you know any of those other games? I mean, I've been in the game industry a long time. I don't even know what those other games are. Now, mind you, this was a time frame just before the iPhone was out, so admittedly those were on, with Brew and J2ME on Nokia phones and feature handsets. They weren't, sort of before the whole smartphone era, and the company almost went bankrupt. They were really, really struggling. The mobile business before the iPhone and Android phones was a tough business to be in. And they said, well, let's give it one more shot. And then they sketched a bunch of ideas, and one of those was Angry Birds, which then became an overnight success for this studio that who already existed 10 years and had made over 50 games. And so, not only kind of a Black Swan, highly improbable, not only this kind of turkey issue or induction problem where you can't anticipate the arrival of a game that's going to be downloaded 2 billion times. They had no ability to anticipate that. They were just trying to survive. But we have lots of examples of this in the game industry, and I'm sure as you're sitting there, you can think of your own industries, of all the different stories you heard of creators or teams or studios, and sort of, overcoming failure, overcoming horrendous failure to get to success. So this is Iran Argosy and Alex Rogopoulos, co-founders of a studio in Boston called Harmonix. Harmonix famously is the studio that made Rock Band and Guitar Hero, both of which are over $1 billion franchises. And yet, these were graduates from MIT, the MIT Media Lab, and they struggled for about a decade. They were at the Media Lab doing synthesis of music and interactivity and all kinds of fun experimental stuff. They tried to make a company around it and do musical games that didn't look anything like what we know as Rock Band and Guitar Hero today. They made a few different attempts. They were fun games, but really didn't resonate. But it was that sort of process, that time that it took for all those ideas and other elements to kind of come together, and the failures and the learning from those failures that then allowed them to create Rock Band and Guitar Hero. This is something that's sort of brought up in another great book from Stephen Johnson, Where Good Ideas Come From, this notion of time. Right? Often we think of, or we only see the end result, and we're like, wow, where did that come from? Again, this overnight success. But we see in the case of Angry Birds, where they had existed almost for 10 years already, making 50 games, or the Rock Band guys, Harmonix, struggling after leaving MIT for over a decade, before they really hit it big. And so amongst many other things, and in fact, the Daphnia story comes from this book, so I admit I don't normally study the sex lives of insects, but so that's actually a story that comes from this book, really interesting book on innovation that's kind of counterintuitive. It really sort of takes a pragmatic look at how to innovate in our context. And that leads me to another concept called the survivorship bias. And again, this sort of relates to Darwin to a certain extent, where the sort of classic story on the survivorship bias, the survivorship bias is that we tend to look at the survivors, the successes, to be inspired, to learn from, as opposed to the failures. And so the survivorship bias, the story is well told from World War II, where the Allied forces, their bombers were getting shot down. They were trying to protect whatever in Europe. I don't remember the details of where the missions were, but they kept getting shot down. And it was not only, killing the pilots and ruining these expensive airplanes, but it meant that the Allies weren't able to protect the right countries or regions or whatever. And so it was this big priority to fix the planes, to make the planes stronger and be able to withstand the ground-to-air artillery or whatever. And so they thought what they would do is when the surviving planes came back, they would look at those planes and say, well, where are the bullet holes? Let's patch those all up and send them back out. And you think, well, that makes sense, right? Let's just patch the holes and off they go again. And then, unfortunately, I forget the name of the sort of the military researcher, but he said, whoa, hold on a second. Don't do that, because those holes tell us where the ship is the most durable, because they got shot there, and despite getting shot there, they still made it back. So we need to go out in the field and find the ones that got shot down and see where they got hit, and those are the vulnerable points and where we need to patch things up. I mean, that sounds kind of obvious to us sitting here, but imagine back then, it was like this revolutionary thought to not look at the survivors or the successes, but actually look at the failures and learn from those failures. And of course they did it, and X many more planes survived, and was a huge success. At Execution Labs, just as a side note, this is one of the things that we kind of force our teams to do. Game designers, game developers tend to always look at the hit games and say, well, what are the trends of all the games that are succeeding? Let's try to put some of that in our games. And that's an important process. It's an important sort of, call it competitive analysis. But we actually force the teams to go look at all the crap games. So if they're making, a ninja game, well, fine, they might look at the 3 or 4 hottest ninja games or fighter game or whatever, race games. But then we also say, well, go find the really crap ones and play those ones a bunch and, learn why, or try to understand why those ones fail. And often the difference is so subtle, it's so slight, and even being able to compare what you're trying to do with your game versus the ones that succeeded versus the ones that failed, the sort of that minuscule, those little differences is quite important. And you don't see that if you're not also comparing it to the failures. And we force them to do more failure, look at more failures than successes. Another thing that we force them to do at the lab is test. No, I mean, I don't mean quality assurance of the code, but actually put their concepts in the hands of players. So this shot is a cardboard with these post-it notes is a prototype of a video game. So you wouldn't normally think of paper necessarily as a prototype, but I mean it's not that dissimilar from mock-ups, paper mock-ups for web design or wireframes and what were storyboards in film. So this is kind of our version of a storyboard to a certain extent. And this is like 1 week into our program. So what's funny is most developers really hesitate. They're shy, like, oh no, it's not ready. I'm still fine-tuning, and I'm a perfectionist. I don't want to show my. It's like, shut up. You're just insecure. Put it in the hands of players. They're going to tell you what's good, what's not good, and even at the earliest stages. And we say, if you don't feel uncomfortable, then it's too late. Right? If you feel all full of confidence, like, yeah, I'm ready, put it in the hands, it's too late. You have to feel uncomfortable. You have to be stressed about putting post-it notes on a cardboard as a test of your amazing vision that you're planning to create. So that's just some of the things we do at the lab. This kind of leads me to the lean startup, which also tells you to test, the whole build, measure, learn loop. A lot of people, I don't think, see the lean startup methodology as a systematic way to fail, right? I mean, he presents it, failure is part of it, and he sort of mentions that you're learning from failures and you're testing and so on. But I mean, I can't emphasize enough that this book is your recipe to systematically fail. He presents it in a very positive way, he presents it in a very productive way, he presents it in a way that sort of is neutral. I mean, you go through this build, measure, learn loop to learn, and if it's a positive learning, well then it's positive. It's a negative learning, there's as much value in the negative learning as there is in the positive because, again, like Francis says, now you know not to do that move in the garage, and you just kind of go back through the build, measure, learn loop again. So, I know VCs and the whole startup scene particularly like the lean startup, but it really is this kind of system for system for system or whatever, a systematic way to fail. All right, so VCs, which is sort of an interesting crowd that we've been dealing with more and more now in the game industry. I don't think they'll ever admit to this per se, but they do have a system for failure, right? They are essentially managing a portfolio, and most of the stuff in that portfolio is going to fail, and some of it will succeed. And when they start, when they invest, they believe you have a chance to be one of those successes, but they don't actually know. And neither do you. I mean, as the entrepreneur, you might say, yes, we'll be $1 billion company or whatever, but chances of that happening are very, very slim. And so the VC essentially has a basket or a portfolio of investments they're making in a systematic way in the hopes that one of them will be this kind of improbable event. There's just no way they're going to know ahead of time. They have to make the 10, 50, whatever, 100 investments in order to uncover or discover which one is the one that's going to make them the $1 billion. There's no way to know that in advance. Similarly, a few years ago, I was doing consulting work with governments around the world who were trying to grow the game industry in their particular region because they thought it was a good business to have in their region, much like the game industry in Montreal is a very vibrant industry. And so I would go in and advise them on what to do and tell them they needed to set up seed funds and incubate all this kind of fun stuff. And the governments were very much wanting to know how to pick the winners. And I said, well, that's kind of weird for a government to worry about picking the winners. And they're like, well, because we can't, we got to worry about our leaders and the press. If we have too many failures, it's going to look bad that we're wasting taxpayer dollars. And so everything's kind of has to be a success. And so part of my work was to sort of tell them, listen, you have to build systems for success to emerge. You have to build a program that enables, 100 games to be made, and 10, maybe 20 of them, or will succeed. And they're like, well, great, just tell us the 10 that will succeed and we'll give them the money. And I said, well, you don't understand. If we give 10 money, then you're lucky if 1 or 2 succeed. Oh, great, let's just give the money to the 2 of them and we're done. And I'm like, well, you need to back up and hold on a second. So this idea of the failures are necessary to uncover the successes, I think is an important one. We see it everywhere. And so going back to the Daphnia, I mean, of course, they're not sitting there saying, let's innovate, let's make a baby that has a different color. I mean, they're not sort of planning it in that way. Obviously, of course, it's instinctive. But this idea of the system itself allows the successes to emerge in this kind of unpredictable way that we cannot anticipate. If you think about that in the work that you do, like how does that shape it? Do you make 20 mock-ups, instead of delivering one? I think, there's this kind of joke where you say, for creative people, all our babies are beautiful, all our babies are precious. And when you only have one baby, you really want to protect it and nurture it. If you're making 100 babies like the Daphnia, you don't really care, right? You're just sort of spawning as much sort of offspring or ideas as possible. And this notion of preciousness, I think, is quite important, that it kind of liberates you to a certain extent, that like the guys that made World of Goo, that every Monday morning they were going to start a new game. And so the game they made last week was just, it was just an experiment. I'll start a new one on Monday, and I know I'm going to start a new one on the next Monday. And so how do you kind of detach yourself from this preciousness of each idea? And one of the things, and we get this all the time, where a designer will come in and say, I've got the most amazing idea, and it's like, here it is, it's all written down, let me tell you about it. And we ask them, well, what's your next idea? What's the next idea you've got? Oh no, that's the only one that I have. And I said, listen, if you want to be a designer, you're going to be in trouble if you only have one idea. And so again, I'm not trying to make this all about sex, but this idea that the Daphnia do teach us sort of this important lesson that in an environment where there's constant change, where things are being disrupted, we can't just clone ourselves and assume that we're going to succeed because our clone or we succeeded yesterday. And so we got to get out there and experiment and explore and fail. Why am I there? Experiment, explore, and just fail a ton, but fail a ton in a systematic way where you're on purpose running at the cliff and jumping off of it because you want to see where you're going to land. So I hope you get out there and fail a whole bunch. Thank you very much.
My question, Jason, is I think everybody in the room here knows that we all need to learn from failures, right?
Yes.
But how do we learn it now from each individual, and what does it take for us to have as a character, as an attitude, or what, to learn the most from our failure? Because this is an internal process. This is not an external process.
Yeah, so Yeah, I mean, so I think learning from failure is important, but one of the points that I'm trying to make is that it's not just that you try to succeed and failure happened and now I'm going to learn from it. It's actually sitting down and thinking about, I need to fail because I don't know where the success is. So how do I, depending what industry sector you're doing, is how do I create a system by which I can fail, and I can the whole fail fast. I can survive those failures in order to discover success. I mean, that's, I think, an important distinction. It's not just, hey, let's learn from our failures. Learning from each other, I mean, I think, coming together in environments like this, I tend to like a nice old-fashioned and getting a bit of alcohol involved to kind of share war stories. People tend to be much more open about their failures once they've had a drink or two. So this is, I'm laying the foundation now for Creative Nights chapter again. Come, have an old, drink. But about the sort of the internal aspect, I mentioned a little bit in this notion of preciousness. It does come from a certain degree of fearlessness. I've been fired from most of the jobs that I've ever had, and so you kind of go in saying like, I'm probably going to get fired again, and you just kind of do your thing, and you fight or you push, and you're exploring boundaries, and if you get fired, it doesn't matter because it's happened a dozen times before, and you just like do this and you go to the next thing, and it always opens new doors and stuff. So it's part of it is sort of freeing your mind that if you fail, it's not a bad thing because you're learning from it. You did it on purpose to discover the opportunity space and so on. But yeah, you're right. You have to adopt this kind of fearless mindset that, as I was saying at the end, you see the cliff. Rather than looking, I'm not sure, where do I jump? A cliff, and you just jump off of it because you've done it 100 times before, and you can land and it's fine, and if you break your legs, no problem, whatever. That's my approach.
Hi, Jason.
Hello.
Thanks for your wonderful talk. You've spoken about various people and how they overcame failure to reach a point of success, but I'm interested in knowing what is a point in your life or an anecdote that you can give to us with regards to failure and how you have survived it and overcome it.
What is the point in your life, Jason?
Yeah, you know,
Tell us.
what's the point? Well, it's like at the beginning. It's like you said, well, our theme is failure, so of course we turn to Jason to come. I wasn't sure how to... yeah, I mean, that's a really good question that I should have anticipated, but I mean, I really view every day as kind of, here's my chance to fail again. Like, you know, I screw up a phone call or an investor meeting doesn't go so well, or, you know, every day is this kind of these little failures all along the way. I mean, I kind of mentioned getting fired a bunch of times. You know, once under suspicion of corporate espionage, which was fun. So maybe getting caught was my bit. No, I'm kidding. I wasn't guilty much. So yeah, you know, I should have a good answer for that. I mean, I think so. For example, execution labs. I mean, it's quite an experimental model. There's no analog for it in the world, particularly in the game industry. You know, we have been inspired by a Y Combinator or Techstars, but really they're nothing like what we're doing. And so, you know, when we started, we said, this sounds like fun. We think we can add value to the ecosystem and make a difference for game developers, but we have no clue if this is actually going to work. And like we're okay with that. Like we're just going to dive in with our best guesses and our experiences and sort of input from others. And we have to be open that as we learn, you know, we'll modify and tweak. And so literally in the first week of operations, we're like, oh shit, that's not working. Like we made a whole bunch of changes. And really in the first week, second week, month, you know, and even now we've been in operations about a year and a half. And right now we're talking again about how we're going to evolve the system and change, in part because, especially in the game industry, the environment is completely disrupted on an everyday basis. So what we dreamed up a year and a half ago as like our model, I mean, almost was not working the first week we opened our doors and have been changing and evolving it. So I mean, so far that's a success, but it's kind of being open and acknowledging that, like, oh, this might totally blow up, but like being okay with that. So yeah, but I'll come up with a better example in the future.